So we're going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about disclosure. So full disclosure, I'm a lawyer. I work with video game companies. We're going to spend 20 minutes helping all of you think a little bit like a lawyer. I'm going to use the framework of who, what, where, when, how, why, which is something we all know from grade school, and I thought it would help teach how to think like a lawyer. If you take one thing away from this, hashtag ad. That's how to avoid government scrutiny. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the 800-pound gorilla, which is really the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC is paying a lot of attention to what the FTC refers to as endorsements, but we think of as influencer advertising or influencer marketing. If the FTC is not paying attention, make no mistake, particularly in the government regime that we're in right now, state attorneys generals are paying attention to whether or not a brand's advertising is deceiving consumers. So another disclosure, I work with game companies, so I'm coming at these issues from the perspective of the brand, not the influencer, not the media agency who might be controlling the influencer, but the brands who are engaging in influencer marketing. So the first two bullet points, definitely paying attention to, is a brand deceiving a consumer with their influencer marketing? Consumers would be the next big piece that you need to think about. We're going to talk about one particular influencer who changed their marketing style because of a watchdog organization's letter that was very public and written about the deceptive nature of that influencer's marketing. So who's responsible? Who's responsible for not deceiving consumers about what? And we'll talk about that in a moment. Brands, for sure. The game company is absolutely at the top of the pyramid in terms of who those prior who's, the FTC, the state's attorneys generals, and consumers are going to be paying attention to. They're out in front. On the other end of the spectrum is obviously the influencer. They're the one making the post, doing the video, but the media companies as well, who are interfacing between the brand and the influencer, have an obligation to make sure that consumers are not being deceived. So all three of these on the chain are responsible for making sure that there's no deception. The brand, the game company, even if they didn't put the post up there, needs to be thinking about, are my influencers doing what I expect them to do? So what's the what? And really, what's the problem? The problem is when someone does something in influencer advertising that a consumer won't know is sponsored, paid for, endorsed by the brand itself. We're going to talk later about CSGO Lotto. The FTC filed a complaint against them. They are currently under an order to monitor and comply with a various list of strict things that they have to do. But let's talk a bit about DJ Khaled. So various liquor companies were sending free product, paying him to post about liquor, and a consumer organization got wind of the fact that these posts were paid and was very upset about it, and his posts now say hashtag ad. That's the easiest way to comply, particularly in a Twitter format, with what the FTC expects. The FTC expects that a consumer will know that liquor company A gave free product to DJ Khaled so that he would post about how awesome the liquor is, and that consumers know that that's a sponsored post. So what do you have to do? Your consumers, they need to know that there is a relationship between the brand and the influencer. I took this screenshot off of YouTube because I thought it was a particularly excellent example, hitting on the different ways in which you would disclose the relationship between this particular influencer and the brand. First, you can see in the video that the influencer used the YouTube function to say includes paid promotion. YouTube doesn't have that display the entire time, which is fine. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But that's good. That's not good enough. The FTC would say just post using YouTube's includes paid promotion function is not good enough to satisfy what the Federal Trade Commission expects your influencers to do on your behalf. So this post is also excellent because he starts with #ad. It's not the second, the third, the 10th word, it's the very first word. And again, the FTC is very fond of or approving of #ad, although there are other ways to disclose a relationship, which you can see if you could read the text. In the first line, it says paid for advertising. So in every instance on this particular post, we have examples of what the Federal Trade Commission would expect an influencer to do on behalf of the brand to show that there's a material connection between that influencer and the brand. This influencer for this post, I would not expect would get any sort of inquiry by the FTC. Let me add a couple who's in there back from that first slide. Although I'm a U.S. lawyer, so I don't advise on what the law is in the UK or in Korea or elsewhere, but there are agencies around the world who are looking at exactly these sorts of things. So if your influencers are international, they often are. It's not just going to be the FTC who could pay attention. Although if you comply generally with these standards, you're going to comply generally with the standards around the world. So you need to disclose that relationship. So when, how, where do you make these disclosures? So when do you need to make a disclosure? And this is particularly, I think, important for certain mobile brands who may start with sort of a friends and families influencer program. The rules are if there is a material connection between the post and the brand, which the FTC has said could mean employees, owners, friends, family. If they're posting favorable things about the brand, and we'll talk about CSGO Lotto, the posts get enough activity and come under scrutiny by the FTC could say you have to disclose the relationship, which is a familial one, not money. The previous panel talked a bit about some brands taking people on trips. Absolutely have to make a disclosure. A trip, it's not cash, but it's still something that the FTC considers to be a material connection between the brand and the influencer. Same thing with early access to games, free products. So the FTC's statement about when do you have to make a disclosure is if knowing about the thing or the service or the access to a person, whatever that might be, would affect the credibility that a consumer would give to the post, then you should disclose. So it's a very broad standard. How do you make a disclosure? And we saw a bit about this in the YouTube screenshot that I took. But make the disclosure close to the claims that are being made. So early, I mean, that's really what that means. Do it early. If it's the first thing that the consumer is going to see, you're not really going to receive FTC scrutiny. If it isn't a long summary of what am I doing and what's this video about, and the very last word is #ad, those are the sorts of things that start to sort of raise the ire. Not usually and often for the format that we're talking about, YouTube, Instagram, and such, but use a font that's easy to read, like very light gray font that's as small as it can be. Those sorts of little tricks are not funny and not well received. Use clear language. I received early access to the game. We saw free paid advertising. Don't try to be deceptive, and don't let your influencers try to hide the ball. Just use very clear language. We've talked a bit about sponsored. I've seen ambassador a lot. Honestly, I don't know what an ambassador is, and I think the FTC is still a little confused about what an ambassador is, although they're willing to engage with things that aren't #ad. They are not amused by #SPON, say sponsored. A really good, if it's a tweet the brand as well, #ad at whatever the video game company is, so that the consumers know who the brand is, even though it should be obvious from the post. Otherwise, it's not a really effective post. But still, this is essentially what the FTC would be looking for. So, big issue really in this space is going to be in video, right? So where do you have to make the disclosure in video? We saw on YouTube, there's the functionality to say that it's a sponsored video. Technically, you're supposed to both make the disclosure in a video in writing and speak it. So if the video is someone streaming a game. I am streaming game X for brand Y. Let's play and go forward. And there should also be a similar written disclosure. Use, again, clear, unambiguous language. Here's the thing at the bottom, though. If it's a really long video, you're going to play for hours on end. The FTC expects you to repeat disclosures throughout the playing of the video in intervals that are regular enough that a consumer jumping into that stream will see and hear the disclosures. What does that mean? Depends. Depends on who your consumer is. It depends on what the stream is. It depends. But if you're the game company and you're engaging an influencer to stream this game for hours on end, I'd say every 15 minutes I'd come up with a regular interval, maybe a half hour. An hour isn't going to be good enough, and so it's, to some extent, right now where we're at in the market, I would say having guidelines for the influencer on some sort of regular redisclosure is probably enough to avoid any, to get an investigation closed, essentially. If there was an inquiry and you say, oh, well, I said every 15 minutes, the FTC might say, I'd prefer every half hour. Okay, thanks. But if you did nothing, then you're going to see more pushback and further investigation. Tweets and posts, same concepts. One additional piece to add, though, is that if there's a more button, for instance, on Instagram, it's the first 3 lines, then you get to more. It has to be in the first 3 lines. The disclosure cannot come later. So whatever the format is, if there is some sort of a more next, it has to come before that. Why? So let's talk about CSGO Lotto. So in the fall of 2017, the Federal Trade Commission filed a complaint against CSGO Lotto and 2 of its owners, or I guess it's only 2 owners, as individuals because of this post and this post and a whole bunch of videos that I haven't included here. If you Google CSGO FTC, you can see what was done. So here's Twitter. There's nothing about hashtag ad. There's nothing about I own this company. There's nothing. And likewise, in this format, there's no hashtag ad, hashtag I own the company, hashtag whatever. The FTC ends this investigation against CSGO Lotto with an order that the individuals and the company have to, 1, give the order to any new employees, any new companies that are related to it, so all officers, directors, employees, agents, et cetera, for I think it's about 5 years, 10 years. For a 5-year period of time, they are under a compliance obligation. They have to track in writing everything that they do to monitor all of the influencer posts that are associated with CSGO Lotto in any way. They have to file declarations with the FTC about everything that they've done to monitor, to comply. It's a very onerous proposition. There were consumer letters that were sent in that suggested that these individuals should have gone to jail, should have paid more money. That didn't happen, but the point is that this kind of advertising is very much, and particularly in the game space, very much under the scrutiny of the Federal Trade Commission these days. And I would expect to see the obligations under any sort of consent order to just increase, frankly, as time goes on. So this is my best practices checklist. When I'm working with a brand, one of the first things we do is we define what the brand considers to be an appropriate disclosure, and in which format. For video, for Twitter, for Instagram, however the influencer is going to be disclosing, we define what we consider appropriate. We require a contract then between either the brand and the agency or the brand and the influencer as to all of the appropriate disclosure practices. We then monitor those posts. We track everything we've done to monitor those posts. We will not work with influencers who don't comply with the guidelines, and we document all of that. So from the brand side of things, if you're going to engage with influencers, this is what I would do. Any questions? Yeah?
Do you see things tightening up, loosening up, or how do you see things change over the last 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? Because we definitely see on the other side of things waves of FTC compliance tightening, and then it sort of loosens up for a while, and then it tightens again. What does that look like from your perspective?
So in terms of the loosening, and I was on a panel with one of the FTC commissioners last month, and she was much looser about how you can disclose the relationship. I think the FTC is much more willing to consider different ways, for instance, ambassador. I think hashtag brand/ambassador will survive FTC scrutiny, even if ambassador is a somewhat ambiguous term. I think in that sense, we're seeing sort of a loosening of things. On the other end, I think we're going to see a more focused attention to certain industries, and I think games are certainly one of them that the FTC is paying a lot of attention to. Lifestyle would be another one that I think the FTC is paying a lot of attention to. We certainly saw at the beginning of last year sort of these warning letters, and 90 of them go out to influencers and to brands. So I think that's the other piece, is that they're paying a lot of attention to the individuals almost as much as they're paying attention to the brands. Whereas sort of, a year and a half ago, the assumption was the brand has to do everything. And now there's a little bit of a recognition that there's some flexibility between the arrangement that the brand might have with the influencer. And I think the interesting thing there will be the extent to which the FTC really goes or starts to go after the agencies that control the influencers. There hasn't been a lot of activity there. I think we'll see more. And I think from our discussion last month, I get the impression that that's expected.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So do the FTC and bodies like them around the world go on fishing trips themselves to find people who aren't complying, or do they rely on complaints from from the audience and from the platforms?
Both. To some extent, there was a lot of industry pressure on the Federal Trade Commission several years ago to define how to work in native advertising. So influencer marketing is a format of native advertising. We can quibble about whether they're the same or they're not the same. But so the FTC, in response to sort of like brand pressure, defined, okay, this is how you disclose in native. And then from there, we have a lot more focused inquiry into the influencer piece of things. And I think the letters that we saw from last year, there were about 90 of them that went to brands and influencers, was more the FTC's own activity. Okay, now that we've been asked to pay attention to this, we have gone out and paid attention to this, and we're letting you know that we issued these endorsement guidelines. The FTC refers to it as endorsement. And we don't think you're complying, and so let us give you another warning as to why we think you're not complying. But certainly, consumers, impact how the Federal Trade Commission feels about advertising. Yeah.
So the regulations that you mentioned, does it only apply to influencer marketing, or does it apply to like more broad domains?
So the Federal Trade Commission's authority is to monitor deceptive advertising, essentially. And so they have a very broad power, if you will, to monitor and make individuals and companies comply with not deceiving consumers. So it's very broad. There are other state statutes, in California in particular, that also relate to deceptive advertising. So there's a variety of different ways in which different bodies, individuals as well, can come at getting at deceptive advertising. Influencer marketing is just one way in which consumers may or may not be deceived.
So, like, let's say that some publishers just throw some ads on Facebook, for example, and those videos, like whatever material they put on as an ad, is like almost irrelevant to their games. But if you watch the video, you click the download, you go to the iStore page, and you saw a game that is completely different from what you saw from the content violation.
So let me say this. Deceptive, false, and misleading advertising is the standard against which all marketing is tested. So if advertising is false or misleading, under various different laws, state and federal, that advertising could violate either that state or federal law. But that's essentially the generic test. Is advertising false or misleading to a reasonable consumer? Yep.
As a developer, if you see an influencer isn't being compliant with these rules, what can you do to protect yourself rather than just call them out on it and ask them to change it a little bit?
Yeah, so what I tell my clients is if you're working with an influencer and you've said this is the disclosure for this campaign and this is how you do it, and that influencer hasn't done it, there are some influencers that you might care a lot more about than others, so they might get sort of a couple bites at the apple. There are others where it's just not worth the hassle, and you might say, you know what, you're not part of this campaign anymore. But from the brand's perspective, you need to be paying attention, to what's being done on your behalf, and then make a risk assessment as to how much you're willing to let slide or not. I would say the more high profile the influencer is, the more risk you're taking on if you're allowing that influencer to not disclose the relationship between you and that influencer. Because that's essentially what you're doing. You're taking on risk. And how much risk are you willing to take on?